Since the late 1960s, a frequent argument put forth to undermine or criticize the utility and validity of IQ is that IQ tests do not measure intelligence, but rather are a measure of social class. To anyone who has studied the literature, or at least made a reasonable attempt at surveying what experts in the field think on this subject, this claim seems ridiculous on its face. So you might be asking, why am I bothering to make a video about this? The reason is primarily because of this guy. He's a blogger that goes by the handle RaceRealist88. Known, in case you're wondering, I'm pretty sure 88 is meant as his birth year. He appears to have started the blog in 2015, basically representing a hereditarian point of view on all things IQ and otherwise. Then in 2017, he began to write articles critical of IQ and the heritability of IQ. So when I see someone apparently coming around to heterodox views on these issues, then basically do a 180 on IQ and heritability, I have to wonder what other than further evaluation of contrary evidence and argument could bring someone to change their mind so dramatically. And when I look into this guy's blog and the amount of work that must go into it, his evolution in thinking on these topics did give me pause. Coming from personal experience, I know how difficult it was to have my mind changed from the modern progressive establishment narrative, and then eventually making videos basically defending the bell curve. That wasn't an easy process, and there's zero incentive to defending this stuff other than intellectual curiosity. In fact, all the incentives are to go with the program and not look at the stuff too closely. So anyway, I contacted this guy on Twitter asking him what books would best represent his views on IQ. I fully expected Ken Richardson to be near the top of the list since this guy quotes him so often in his blog articles. Anticipating this, I'd already purchased a used copy of Genes, Brains, and Human Potential. I haven't finished this book yet, but it attempts to deconstruct everything about IQ testing and IQ heritability before then apparently rebuilding an alternative understanding of both of these. In this video, I will restrict my response to the validity of IQ testing itself. The heritability of IQ will be addressed in a separate video. In this response, I will be addressing two books by Ken Richardson, Genes, Brains, and Human Potential, and The Making of Intelligence. In addition, I'll be responding to his 2002 article, What IQ Tests Test. There isn't much difference in the information presented in these three sources, at least regarding the arguments against the validity of IQ, so I will be flipping back and forth between them frequently. Having two of Richardson's books in front of me, I first tried to assess, is this really worth my time, and how much of these am I going to actually read? Now, it could be that this guy is like James Flynn, taking the evidence at hand head-on, coming up with original research, and presenting something as powerful as the Flynn effect that presents a true paradox for interpreting IQ as representing human intelligence. However, given that I found basically zero responses to Richardson in the literature, I wasn't hopeful, and it didn't take me long to realize this wasn't going to be the case. Instead, I found many things that were more typical of Stephen Jay Gould, slandering long-dead men that aren't here to defend themselves, deceptive quoting, and brushing over issues where a proper nuanced understanding of the issue would largely contradict the point the author is trying to make. The most egregious example of this was his section on Henry Goddard from his book Genes, Brains, and Human Potential. Goddard was an American psychologist who was particularly concerned with the heredity of feeble-mindedness. According to Wikipedia, he introduced the term moron for clinical use. As Richardson correctly points out, Goddard established an intelligence testing program on Ellis Island in 1913 in order to test arriving immigrants. However, he makes numerous factual errors in this section. To quote Richardson, amid distressing scenes at the infamous reception center on Ellis Island, he managed to ensure that all immigrants, men, women, and children of all ages, were given the IQ test as soon as they landed. This is untrue on several levels. As Goddard himself says in his own writings, he only tested immigrants in, quote, steerage, and did not test immigrants in first or second class. Also, the very first sentence of Goddard's paper, Mental Tests and the Immigrant, the very first sentence says, quote, "This is a study not of immigrants in general, but of 6 small, highly selected groups, 4 of average normals and 2 of apparent defectives, all of them steerage passengers at Ellis Island." Basically, Goddard was trying to use Alfred Binet's test to see if he could distinguish, quote, feeble-minded from, quote, average normal people. Therefore, he had a group that was pre-selected to see if the test agreed with their casual assessment. Goddard acknowledges the problematic nature of this method. To quote Goddard, 2 problems were set. First, whether persons trained and work with the feeble-minded could recognize by simple inspection the feeble-minded immigrant. Second, to what extent, if any, could mental tests be successfully applied to the detection of defective immigrants. Richardson goes on to state, quote, "By these means, the country came to be told that 83% of Jews, 80% of Hungarians, 79% of Italians, and 87% of Russians were feeble-minded." This is absolutely untrue. As Goddard says in the second sentence of his entire paper, quote, "The study makes no determination of the actual percentage, even of those groups who are feeble-minded." Of the pre-selected groups, Richardson does accurately quote the actual percentage of the groups that were defined as, quote, feeble-minded, according to the Binet-Simon test. However, Goddard did not think these results should be taken at face value. Quote, "The reader familiar with the history of mental testing will realize something of the difficulty we faced. We were in fact most inadequately prepared for the task. There were scarcely any tests standardized at the time. Even the Binet-Simon scale was so new as to still largely be in the experimental stage." However, to be fair, Goddard does also state, quote, "One can hardly escape the conviction that the intelligence of the average third-class immigrant is low, perhaps of moron grade." But Goddard did not think that these, quote, morons were necessarily the result of heredity. In fact, he concluded it was more probable that their condition was due to environment. Quote, "We know of no data on this point, but indirectly we may argue that it is more probable that their condition is due to environment than it is due to heredity. To mention only two considerations. First, we know that their environment has been poor. It seems to be able to account for the result. Second, this kind of immigration has been going on for 20 years. If the condition were due to hereditary feeble-mindedness, we should properly expect a noticeable increase in the proportion of the feeble-minded of foreign ancestry. This is not the case." Richardson then continues, quote, "There seems little doubt that such findings contributed to the xenophobia that swept America in the decade of the 1920s and led to the 1924 Immigration Act that introduced an immigration quota system." As you might expect at this point, this sentence is not supported by any evidence either. For a full account of this claim, reference the paper Intelligence Tests in the Immigration Act of 1924 by Mark Snyderman and Richard Herrnstein. This paper rebuts the slander of Henry Goddard, as I just covered, but then also thoroughly reviews the congressional record and testimony, finding almost no evidence that intelligence tests had any influence over the content or the passage of the 1924 Immigration Act. There's a reason I singled out this section in Richardson's book to thoroughly examine. This claim against Henry Goddard is not new. As far as I know, this was first claimed by Leon Kamin in his book The Science and Politics of IQ, published in 1974. This claim was then amplified by his buddy Stephen Jay Gould in his book The Mismeasure of Man in 1981, and then the claim was again repeated in the 1996 paperback edition. However, these claims against Goddard and their relevance to the 1924 Act were powerfully rebutted, if not completely debunked, by the Snyderman-Herrnstein paper in 1983. Richardson's book was published in 2017. This is completely inexcusable, and I would argue an indication that Richardson's work has a lot of its roots in arguments that originated in the 1970s, and the formulation of these arguments have basically ignored, or at best extremely selectively referenced, any work in the almost 50 years since that would challenge them. So maybe it's possible somehow that Richardson was unaware of the Snyderman-Herrnstein paper. I highly doubt it, but let's say for the sake of argument. In his 2002 paper, What IQ Tests Test, he cites the book Measuring Minds by Leela Zinderlin 6 different times. Well, let's just say my Amazon account has been extremely active in the past month or so. So I bought this book, Measuring Minds, and in large part, it's a biography of Henry Goddard, to quote Zinderland. While Goddard believed that most of these immigrants were indeed mentally weak, he wondered about the cause. Are these immigrants of low mentality cases of hereditary defect, Goddard now asked pointedly, or cases of apparent mental defect by deprivation? If the former, they still posed a threat to posterity. If the latter, then Americans need have no fears about the succeeding generations. While Goddard knew of no data to settle this vital question, he himself believed it far more probable that their condition is due to environment than is due to heredity. Their environment has been poor and seems to account for the result, he decided. She continues in the next paragraph, quote, "Such conclusions could hardly be said to support those calling for more restrictive legislation." So, as we'll see later, Richardson cites sources that, if read in their entirety, frequently contradict his claims. Now, to be clear here, I am not defending Goddard in general, just against this claim. I know he was a supporter of eugenic policies, which I do not support in any way, and I realize that Goddard's findings were misinterpreted by the media at the time, but I find it telling that despite the record being corrected in 1983, this tale of Goddard is transmitted from 1974 all the way to 2017, apparently oblivious to this correction. Part of the reason I think tales such as this are transmitted through the decades, seemingly impervious to any criticism, is that many of these authors simply do not engage with the hereditarians on these issues. It seems like they just read each other's work, and sometimes accidentally give strong indications that they did not even read what they are criticizing. Nevin Sasardik found a humorous example of this where 7 different authors that were highly critical of Arthur Jensen got the citation of his famous 1969 Harvard Educational Review article wrong. They cited it as being in volume 33 instead of volume 39. Interestingly, all these publications came out sometime after 1981, in which Stephen Jay Gould made the exact same citation mistake. As Sesardic notes, this is, quote, an extremely unlikely coincidence, or else reveals that these authors' references to Jensen's paper actually originate from contact with Gould's text, not Jensen's. Similarly, I have no doubt that Richardson picked up this tale of Goddard from Gould or Kamen, not from his own research. So before getting onto Richardson's arguments, I noticed a few other odd things in his book that are worth mentioning. On page 8 of Genes, Brains, and Human Potential, he discusses the history of the general intelligence factor G. Unsurprisingly, he doesn't consider it a valid concept. He has a passage in his book in which he says, "Indeed, such a proposition put by Charles Spearman in 1915 has been described as the single biggest discovery in psychology. He introduced the concept of general intelligence, or G, although he was later to admit that the idea is poorly defined." There is no citation given for this claim. I've read Spearman himself and quite a bit written about Spearman. He never thought that G was poorly defined as far as I can tell. He did have to modify his two-factor theory, which framed the variance in mental test results to be entirely due to G, the general factor, and S, or specific factor, which was unique to a particular test item. Spearman eventually had to acknowledge that there appeared to be group factors, verbal ability, math, etc., that indicated that his two-factor theory was too simplistic. However, Spearman never thought that G was poorly defined. This quote by Richardson makes it sound as if even the guy who invented G seemed to have in a sense lost faith in the concept, which is simply not true. When he does quote a source I was familiar with and something didn't quite sound right, I went back to the source to verify. In another instance of him using a proponent of the G factor seeming to admit that it isn't well defined, he quotes the bell curve. The evidence for a general factor was ... circumstantial, based on statistical analysis rather than direct observation. Its reality therefore was and remains arguable. Usually when I see ellipsis like this, the quote is eliminating irrelevant verbiage for the sake of brevity. So I wondered what he was cutting out of the quote, and I found it rather astonishing, 2 words. The evidence for a general factor was pervasive but circumstantial. Pervasive but? I mean, what the hell? That doesn't even diminish the point that much, but I think it gives you a glimpse into the mind of the author. He's trying to dig up stuff where Spearman or Charles Murray or somebody is admitting that something he's arguing against has major weaknesses. So he finds that quote and thinks, pervasive. That makes it sound as if there's a lot of evidence for this. I don't like that. But I like the part where he says the evidence is circumstantial and the reality remains arguable. So I'll just cut that part out. Who's actually going to check this? The vast majority of my readers wouldn't be caught dead owning the bell curve, much less actually reading it in any detail. Besides, I put ellipsis, it's all legal and above board. I found several other instances similar to this, but this video's already going to be long enough, so I cut them out. But the point is, when I first started skimming his work, when I saw a quote from a source I was already familiar with, sometimes they sounded very suspect, and sure enough, when I went back and checked, my suspicion was usually confirmed. So anyway, despite poisoning the well a bit there on Richardson's ethics, I'll now try to honestly represent his critique of IQ. I think his critique can be roughly reduced to about 3 bullet points. So number 1, there is no formal theory of intelligence, so IQ tests cannot have what is known as construct validity. You can't prove that IQ tests test intelligence if you don't have an adequate theoretical model for intelligence to begin with. Number 2, although IQ tests correlate with academic achievement and occupation attainment, this is because IQ is largely a measure of social class. He claims that social class is the causal factor for academic achievement and occupation status, and that the IQ test erroneously attributes this to intelligence, however that is defined. And number 3, and most importantly, the reason IQ tests predict academic achievement and occupation status is because these correlations are built into the test through test construction. He also asserts that nearly everything that is claimed to be known about IQ testing is a consequence of test construction. So first, on construct validity. I realized while writing this script that none of the 3 sources I'm referencing actually use the term construct validity. I associated this term with Richardson because this race realist guy makes this point frequently, often adjacent to where he's quoting Richardson. So my response is, this is a valid criticism to a certain extent. Of the more sophisticated advocates of IQ testing, such as Arthur Jensen, they fully admit that since there is no theoretical construct or objective measure of intelligence, it cannot be independently verified that IQ tests are measuring it. Arthur Jensen comments on this issue in his 1980 book, Bias in Mental Testing, quote, "Construct validity may be defined theoretically as the correlation between scores X and the construct C the test is intended to measure. In reality, of course, the problem is we have no direct measure of C, and so the process of construct validation is roundabout, consisting mainly of showing in more and more different ways that the test scores behave as should be expected if, in fact, the test measures the construct in question. So no, it cannot be claimed that IQ tests have construct validity in the strict definitional sense, but there is circumstantial evidence that IQ tests are measuring what some people would call intelligence to a certain extent. The pages in Jensen's book following this quote go into this evidence if you're interested, link in the description. And so while I partially agree with this criticism, I don't consider it a fatal flaw for IQ testing, considering the external validity that IQ tests demonstrate for predicting academic and job performance. More on this later. So now for Richardson's claim that IQ is a measure of social class. First, I want to say that if you're trying to establish that IQ is a measure of social class more so than intelligence, I would expect some demonstration or argument that operationalizes social class somehow and demonstrates equal or greater predictive validity than what IQ has been demonstrated to predict already. There is one already existing measure used in social science that attempts to capture social class, namely socioeconomic status, or SES. SES is typically represented as a standardized score that is a composite of the occupation, education, and income of the family. We already know that IQ only correlates with SES at about 0.3, and that IQ has robust and significant predictive validity once SES is controlled for. The entire section 2 of the bell curve was a thorough demonstration of this. They performed logistic regression using SES and IQ as independent variables to predict chances of graduating high school, going on welfare, and dozens of other social outcomes. They found that in nearly every case, IQ was a stronger predictor than SES, and still had substantial predictive power once SES was controlled for. Richardson acknowledges this and instead argues that SES is an insufficient proxy for social class. He cites a few pieces of data to support this and points to a few studies that show large correlations between certain family environments and IQ. Before engaging with any of Richardson's supporting evidence for IQ being a proxy for social class, there's one piece of evidence to point to that I think makes this claim difficult to even get off the ground, so to speak. In any possible conception of social class I can conceive of, I would think that social class would be fairly stable within one's own family. If it is not, then I'm not sure what social class would even mean. Richardson does maintain that his conception of social class is not adequately represented by socioeconomic status, but still I'm going with the assumption that social class varies between families rather than within families. So one of the most significant problems for the social class hypothesis is that most of the IQ variation in society is within families. If you take two random strangers in the United States and compare their IQ, they will differ by 17 points on average. If you take any two siblings within any random household in the United States, they differ by 12 points on average. So about 70% of the IQ variation in society is due to within-family differences. How can that possibly be reconciled with the notion that IQ is a measure of social class? So neglecting that problem for the moment, what does Richardson mean exactly when he says IQ is a proxy for social class? More precisely, he claims that IQ is a measure of, quote, degree of socio-cognitive effective preparedness for IQ tests, which is in itself an index of social class. He's essentially claiming that a middle-class household will provide a background of mental stimulation that will prepare a child to better perform on IQ tests. This makes some intuitive sense, especially for something like vocabulary. He distinguishes SES from social class by citing data indicating that current parental SES can vary in a relatively short period of time. Therefore, while a family's social class may remain stable, SES may not, making correlations between SES and other variables smaller than if SES were a true measure of social class. I didn't check his source on this claim, but I'll assume he's representing it accurately. He also asserts that, quote, whilst it is usually the father's occupation that is taken as the family SES, it is the mother's belief systems that are most related to the direction of their children's cognitive development. In particular, he describes earlier in the same paper, quote, this includes such variables as parental interest and encouragement with school-related learning, their educational and occupational aspirations for their children, maternal involvement in play, provision of opportunities for learning, and so on. Correlations of 0.6 to 0.7 between such variables and IQ have been regularly reported. A correlation of 0.6 to 0.7 is quite rare in social science. 0.7 is an extremely impressive correlation. One of the sources he references for this claim is McIntosh 1998, titled IQ and Human Intelligence. This is actually a great book. In fact, I would recommend this book over the bell curve as an intro into everything IQ. Anyway, McIntosh does cover some of these studies on page 129, but Richardson does not mention the strong caveats that McIntosh presents following his summary of these studies. For instance, quote, the general pattern of findings in these studies is strikingly consistent, and the correlations reported with the developing child's IQ is impressively high. but this does not mean that their interpretation is equally clear or unambiguous. However plausible it may be that parental involvement in attitudes, or the provision of appropriate toys, games, and books should be beneficial to a young child's IQ, the establishment of these correlations alone will never prove that one is the direct cause of the other. There are two obvious alternative possibilities. So McIntosh then summarizes two alternative possibilities. The first possibility is that it's the child's behavior itself that elicits the response from the parent, and the second possibility is that, quote, parents influence their children's development at least as much by the genes they pass on to them as their actual behavior towards them. The second possibility can be broadly categorized into what Arthur Jensen called the sociologist's fallacy. In searching for environmental explanations for the variation in IQ, it is often assumed that the environment has a direct and causal effect on the phenotype. But the sociologist rarely considers the possibility that the genotype of the parent affects the environment provided to the child as well as providing a direct contribution to the phenotype by passing on their genes. In fact, McIntosh cites studies such as Longstreth et al. 1981 that found once the mother's IQ is controlled for, the effect of differences in home environment provided to the child, as assessed through a 2-hour interview with the mothers, no longer produced a statistically significant correlation. In fact, you can keep adding variables to a home environment index until you end up with a very high correlation with the child's IQ. But unless you compare those variables with parental IQ and throw out the variables that highly correlate with that, you're going to end up with a very spurious correlation in terms of the environmental contribution to the child's IQ. For instance, is the number of books in the house an important influence on child IQ, or do parents with higher IQ have more books in the house and also, in part, pass down genes for higher IQ to their children? Now, to be fair, McIntosh doesn't find this study to be a complete refutation of the high correlations found between parental attitudes, aspirations, and so on with a child's IQ, but he also doesn't think those high correlations can be possibly taken at face value. In 1995, a paper by Winship and Korenman was published titled A Reanalysis of the Bell Curve. The author speculated that the SES score used in the bell curve's analysis was too simplistic and narrowly defined, thus artificially inflating the predictive power of IQ. The authors came up with an experimental scheme that Charles Murray says he wished he had thought of himself. The National Longitudinal Survey of Youth contained a number of siblings. By using only the siblings from the dataset, you can basically control for everything in the home environment. Using this scheme, known as a fixed effects analysis, the authors recomputed the regression coefficients for the logistic regressions. What they found can be summarized in this sentence in the introduction, quote, incredible as it may seem, our sibling analysis suggests that, even though Herrnstein and Murray's parental SES index is poorly measured and narrowly conceived, it appears in most cases adequate for producing unbiased estimates of the effect of AFQT scores on socioeconomic outcomes. As an aside, the AFQT is the Armed Forces Qualifying Test, which is really just an IQ test. And the SES index that they say is poorly measured and narrowly conceived, this is really just the standard way that SES is computed. So the authors do find numerous things to criticize and nitpick in the bell curve analysis, but this basic point is undeniable. For instance, here's the chance of dropping out of high school from IQ of 130 down to IQ 70 using the bell curve's methodology for controlling for SES, and here's the same curve using the sibling fixed effects analysis. I produced both of these graphs using the regression coefficients provided in the paper. The authors noted a few instances where the two methods diverged, such as the chance of ending up in poverty. The authors identified these by the difference in regression coefficients, but as can be seen here, once you actually plot the logistic regression, how different are they really? So to summarize, you can come up with incredibly fancy SES scores including everything but the kitchen sink, but when you take siblings within the same family, you're effectively controlling for all of these possible variables that can be added to an SES index. And it turns out that a simple SES variable that's just the parental education, occupation, and income does a pretty good job for controlling for, quote, social class. Another important piece of evidence relevant to the social class hypothesis is a phenomenon known as the Wilson effect. The Wilson effect is the observation that the heritability of IQ increases with age, and by adulthood, the effect of the home environment has almost zero contribution to individual differences in IQ on average. To be clear, this is not to deny that various environmental effects that could influence adult IQ do not differ between households, just that they are not common in the general population. So while the Wilson effect is not in conflict with evidence for an enriching home environment benefiting a child's IQ, it does indicate that later in life this effect will fade relative to the child's peers. Whether you care more about a person's IQ as a child or an adult is possibly a subjective question, but I would argue that the adult IQ is of far greater sociological importance. The only other piece of evidence supplied by Richardson where he actually puts numbers to it is that the subjective assessments of teachers have greater predictive validity in terms of academic achievement than IQ tests. Note that this has no direct bearing on the question of whether IQ is a measure of social class, but I found it a sloppy way to diminish the utility of IQ testing. To quote Richardson, "It has long been demonstrated that teachers can predict with far greater accuracy and in a fraction of the time the future achievements of their pupils." One review suggested a correlation of around 0.66, which far surpasses the predictive power of an IQ test. The citation he provides is a meta-analysis. I found this meta-analysis a little difficult to read in terms of what precisely was being claimed by the result, so I dug down into the studies included in the meta-analysis. What I found is that these teachers' assessments were of their own pupils that they have taught, observed, and presumably given quizzes and exams to. The teachers were then asked to rate their expectations of how students would perform on standardized tests of academic achievement. The first thing to mention here is that this is not really predictive, it's more like concurrent validity. In one of the few studies included in the meta-analysis that I could find, the teachers were asked to provide these assessments immediately before students took the standardized test. Also, how would this be, quote, in a fraction of the time? Were the teachers given 45 minutes to interview students they'd never met before, one by one, and then provide these subjective assessments? It seems in reality the teachers were able to casually, and in terms of exams quantitatively, observe students' intelligence, attentiveness, and work ethic. When IQ is combined with a personality test, measures of IQ and conscientiousness, which is basically work ethic, often provide validity coefficients above 0.6 anyway. So basically the data on teacher assessment isn't surprising or even very interesting when put into proper context. If your job is to teach children and you're able to get feedback on how well they're learning, you're likely to be able to predict how well they'll do on a test that measures what they've learned. And the time investment to accomplish this is certainly greater than taking an IQ test. Now, maybe you could say that the marginal time cost is small. Nearly every child is already in school. But if you're a parent being told your child needs to be placed in remedial classes, what are you more likely to trust? The judgment of a single random teacher, or an IQ test standardized on thousands of children from a representative sample of the population with a test-retest reliability of over 0.9? So these two items I just covered were the only two pieces of evidence I noticed in his writings where he actually puts numbers to his arguments. But again, disregarding the extremely questionable veracity of those two claims, I want to emphasize how he never actually operationalizes social class. This is in itself one of my main problems with this guy. If you want to claim that IQ is a proxy for social class, come up with some measure of social class and show that it predicts what IQ tests predict at an equal or greater correlation. Another potential problem for the social class hypothesis are the various things IQ has been found to correlate with, which make intuitive sense if IQ is indeed a proxy for intelligence. I'll give a few examples that came to mind while I was writing the script. This is by no means a comprehensive list. First, it is well substantiated that IQ correlates with brain size, especially when measured with magnetic resonance imaging. A smaller but still statistically significant correlation is found with a simple head circumference measurement. It has also been found that this relationship holds among siblings, making any kind of social class explanation much more difficult. Second, automobile fatality rates. A study of military veterans in Australia produced the following distribution, showing an overwhelmingly higher rate of fatalities for those testing below IQ 85. And finally, reaction time has been found to correlate at about 0.2 to 0.3 with IQ. This is done using a device where the subject holds down a button, then releases it when a light goes off. Even higher correlations approaching 0.5 are found with what is known as choice reaction time, where the subject has multiple buttons they can press depending on the stimulus provided. So they must react and then think quickly to hit the correct button. Needless to say, correlation does not equal causation, but telling a plausible-sounding story about such correlations is much easier to accomplish when IQ is considered a proxy for intelligence rather than social class. Towards the end of my research for this video, I did finally stumble across an article criticizing Richardson from none other than Arthur Jensen. Apparently, Richardson was able to get Jensen's attention by writing a critical review of Jensen's 1998 book, The G Factor. The opening line of Jensen's reply pretty much summed up the conclusion I had already arrived at. Quote, IQ is certainly not, quote, merely a surrogate for social class, unquote, or socioeconomic status, as declared throughout nearly all of Richardson's commentary. His ad hoc arguments are straight from the armchair and cannot be supported by any systematic body of empirical evidence. Well, couldn't have said it better myself. Now, you might think that Jensen is attacking a straw man by reducing social class to simply SES, but Richardson does not make that distinction in the article Jensen is replying to. So while I'm sure that there's some defenders of Richardson that could point to some aspect of his argument on social class that I'm not addressing, I'm going to call it good on my refutation of the social class argument. Given what we know about home environment effects on IQ by adulthood, that IQ predicts differential success among siblings within the same family, and that most IQ variation is within families, not between families, this places a large burden upon those making this argument, and Richardson falls far short of carrying it, in my opinion. So that's it for part 1 of this video series. I decided to break it up into smaller sections since it was becoming far too long for my taste. Stay tuned for the next part, in which I will cover what I consider Richardson's most interesting and demonstrably wrong set of claims on IQ test construction.